I'm Marty Olsen, and welcome to another edition of City Focus. And tonight I'm delighted to have as my guest the relatively new Executive Director of New London Landmarks, Laura Natusch. And I want to welcome Laura to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on the program, Marty.
Well, I'm looking forward to a good opportunity to educate the community about landmarks and what their mission is, what they're doing. And there's a myriad of things we can sink our teeth into. But before we get into that, I think it would be appropriate to introduce our audience to you. And
sure.
And who is Laura Natusch, and how did you get to New London, and what are your interests and your educational background and things of that nature?
Sure. I am a farm girl from upstate New York. I grew up in the Upper Hudson Valley. Came to initially Rhode Island to go to school at Rhode Island School of Design. Stayed in Rhode Island for quite a while, then kind of kept inching my way further across the border. Got to New London in 2000. Before that, I was in Mystic. Came here actually in part because of the historic downtown, where my husband rented a studio for his wood shop, immediately. And then I also came here because of the arts community.
And Jay Kaiser's your husband.
Correct, and he builds harpsichords.
And he's also a musician, so
Yes.
So the two of you kind of naturally fit right in with the downtown art scene.
Sure, and actually he was already acting with Flock Theater too, so that was another draw for us. So then, let's see, I came to feel at home in New London within several weeks of moving here, in part because we have a very walkable downtown. When I first moved here, I thought, how am I going to get to meet people? So I decided that I just walked into Muddy Waters. It was Muggs then. And I said, well, if I'm a barista for a while, I will meet everybody in town. And that worked. I think within 2 weeks, I had dozens of friends. Then I began working with Jake. And he was building the harpsichords. I was doing some of the woodworking. And I was primarily decorating the soundboards. Harpsichord soundboards have these beautiful, fanciful decorations with birds and butterflies and plants, and that was a lot of fun for me. It gave me a chance to use my arts background professionally. Then I began teaching at Mitchell College as an adjunct faculty member. And then...
It's fun. I've done that as well, but I'm in business and economics, and I've enjoyed that.
Yeah, you get to work with young people, you get to see people develop. It gave me a reason to do more research. I think I was checking out 10 books every week from the library because I had gaps in my own knowledge. I was sometimes only a few steps ahead of my students. And I'm kind of wonky, I'm kind of nerdy, so I like research.
And when we had our change in government, before we did that, I mean, I know when I met you, you were selling soap at the farmers market downtown, yeah. And so obviously you've got a talent there as well to make and market and sell products of that nature.
Thank you. Yeah, I kept that. In fact, you were one of my customers. Thank you very much. In fact, a lot of people that are still very prominent in New London today. Mayor Passero was one of my customers, so I'm very grateful to him for that as well. I started making soap because I wanted to make something that was useful to the community, something that was affordable to the community, something that people would buy again and again. Coming from a painting background, I know that there are only a limited number of paintings that I'm going to be buying in my lifetime, even as much as I love the arts, but I'm going to buy a lot of bars of soap. Yeah. And then so I wanted to take something humble, but I wanted to make the best bar of soap possible, as natural as possible, as skin-friendly as possible. And then I wanted to be part of farmers markets. I just loved farmers markets. I love the community that forms around farmers markets, and I wanted to be part of that local economy. I wanted to make something right here that people right here were going to use. Mm-hmm.
And do you still do that, or do you not have time for that endeavor anymore?
No, I gave that up when I started working in former Mayor Finizio's office, because I was always on call. I couldn't commit to farmers markets. Soap making for me did not make economic sense if I was just going to do 1 or 2 batches a year, because when you buy the ingredients in a very small quantity, it just doesn't make financial sense. But I keep thinking about it. And I keep getting a lot of people asking me to do it. So maybe like around Christmas time, maybe I'll start making a little bit of soap again. Mm-hmm. I still have the soap studio upstairs in my house.
Well, there you go. Well, time will tell.
Yeah.
Now, have you always been a political person or a political activist? Because you certainly got wrapped up when we changed our government. You were an ardent supporter of candidate and to become a mayor for Nunzio.
Embarrassingly, no, I was not political in my young life. I may not have even voted in my 20s. I am ashamed to say that. But all you young millennials, learn from me. Don't repeat that mistake. Be politically engaged. I first became engaged with, I think it was Ned Lamont's campaign in his primary. Mm-hmm. And I also, at the same time, knocked door to door for Joe Courtney. And then I became more involved in local campaigns, and then I ran for office myself.
Well, you did. That would have been in 09?
Was it?
No, it was 11.
It was later, yeah.
No, 13.
Yeah. Oh, and I was campaign manager for the Green Party candidates.
Okay, yeah. So you not necessarily have been a pure Democrat. You've got a green...
I'm a real progressive Democrat.
Well, I would say Greens tend to be real progressive Democrats to a degree.
For people who don't know the history that Marty and I are talking about, we had a friendly rivalry back in 2011, and you got on city council beating me out by something like a little under 24 votes, right?
It was close.
It was close, and I was thrilled to be that close to a very popular former mayor. And I'm very happy to be sitting here with you tonight and working with you at Landmarks. Marty is on our board. And he's a very strong board member. Well,
thank you. I appreciate that. And I think it's important having Laura on as a guest tonight that the folks do know that under full disclosure that I am on the Landmarks board and was recruited by our former director, Constance Christophic, and she's going to be getting recognized later this week.
That's right. We are having a party for her, a belated going away. Thank you for everything you did for us. We love you, Constance Christophic party. That's going to be at Dev's. It's open to the public this Friday from 7 to 8:30. We are buying a bunch of appetizers, and I just know Constance would love to see everybody who's been involved with Landmarks, and that's a lot of people.
And she did a terrific job. But,
She did. She's full of positive energy. She's a real go-getter. She was a great choice for the organization.
Yeah, very good. Well, hopefully we'll see some of you folks Friday early in the evening. Let's see now. You, on top of running for office, you have served for the city on the personnel board, and you're involved with Fiddleheads, the National Foods Co-op.
Yeah.
So you're involved with that, and you're on their board of directors as well?
No, I used to be. I used to be during the year that they opened.
Okay.
I actually stepped back because I thought it was a conflict of interest for me to have my soap making business while serving on the board when they decided to host a farmer's market where I was a vendor. Okay. And we were setting vendor rates, and I didn't think it was going to be ethical.
Well, that's gotta like that you have those those ethical boundaries. I think it's important. Sometimes things get lost in the shuffle, and people push those boundaries. And I commend you for that.
Thank you.
Folks, you're watching City Focus, and I'm Marty Olsen, your host, and I'm joined tonight by Laura Natusch, who's the Executive Director for New London Landmarks. And what is Landmarks? What is the mission? What is from your perspectives, and you've been on the job now since April
3rd. Yeah.
And Landmarks has certainly been in the news a lot since you've been on board. So you stepped right into the middle of a couple of hot button issues. But before we get to those, let's kind of get people kind of understanding what Landmarks is, what they're supposed to be doing, and its role in the community.
Sure. And I think that what New London Landmarks does is a little broader than people may realize. People think, oh, they're a historic preservation group. They must save buildings. And sure, we do, but that's a small part of our, not a small part, it's a part of our mission. So our mission is to promote the preservation and the development, that's key, the development of the urban environment of New London, including the significant individual structures, the streetscapes, the neighborhoods, and the open spaces. So that encompasses a lot more than just this building, that building. So I want to pick that apart a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Like, why is development in our mission statement? And we really believe that preservation and development are like this. They complement each other, they support each other. And to understand why that works, maybe it's good to go back in time to when people believed the opposite, and we can see that that failed. You go back to the time of urban renewal, and you look at neighborhoods destroyed, buildings that saw the wrecking ball. In New London, you can look at how certain neighborhoods were disconnected from each other, either by tearing down different neighborhoods, maybe to put up public housing. People certainly didn't have bad intentions with that, but it's caused problems. Or for the highway to cut through. If you look at Hodges Square, it's not...
New London's had to deal with two major redevelopment projects, the Winthrop Cove in the north end of town, and Shaw's Cove, I want to say the southern end of town, but it's on the southern side of Bank Street.
Right.
And their debilitating effects, and probably even more so, is the construction of the second Gold Star Bridge.
That's right. It took a lot of property off the tax rolls. It disconnected neighborhoods from each other and made it harder to revitalize a neighborhood, Hodges Square, or Northeast New London, that was disconnected from downtown. I've spoken to people who lived in New London since they were children and live in that neighborhood, and they did not know their way around downtown. It wasn't part of their everyday life. I found it shocking because it's really, in terms of distance, it's not far. Yeah, but in terms of walkability,
it's not walkable.
Exactly. And if you go back to what urban renewal tried to do, people thought, it's just old buildings. They didn't think of it any better than thinking about like, old clothes or any bunch of garbage that you might toss out, right? It was like, we should have something shiny and modern, not this run-down, blighted neighborhood.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, and I was a teenager when a lot of this was going on, and it was difficult to understand the effects. And
Sure. Nobody had a crystal ball. They didn't understand how this would play out.
I recall how I think landmarks kind of got its beginnings in this time frame, especially when there was the big push to tear down Union Station, and Claire Dale and others stepped up and fought that vehemently and successfully.
Mm-hmm. That's right. We were formed 41 years ago specifically to save Union Station, and so.
But Whale Oil Row was saved.
Yes.
Attorney McGuire's building, which is now, I believe, the New London Community Foundation is now housed in there on Federal Street. Mm-hmm. But these were 5 buildings that were saved.
Right. And sometimes it's hard to see these buildings' potential in the moment. In my neighborhood, I've seen photographs of buildings on Hempstead Street or Franklin Street that you would have thought these buildings could never be saved. Look at old photographs of Star Street. That looked beyond repair. But
Star Street was on the cusp of being bulldozed.
Exactly. And it's unthinkable to us now that Union Station was also endangered. It's built by a famous architect, Henry Hobson Richardson, one of the few architects in the United States who actually has a style named after him. But I can't even imagine a more beautiful sight in New London than walking along State Street now and seeing Union Station, seeing the Bark Eagle next to it, the river. It really anchors downtown New London, and economically it helps us because we're a multimodal transit center. So there's a perfect example of how historic preservation became an economic driver for New London. You go further down Bank Street, you can take a look at the Hygienic. That was a grassroots effort to save a building that could have become a parking lot.
And again, that was a building that was, again, on the cusp of being torn down for a parking lot for the bank across the street.
It came within 9 days of being demolished.
And Jim Stidfol and
Vinny
Scarano.
Davo.
And they stepped up to the plate and probably didn't even know what they were really getting into until they did.
But it was important enough that they took the time to learn. They didn't back down from that challenge. And they had a lot of community support. That was important too.
And who would have thought, however many years ago, that building and the people who were involved then and still are,
that's right,
that the Hygienic would be kind of the driver of the arts scene.
And then that spills out beyond the arts scene. Then that helps support the local restaurants.
Absolutely.
Yeah, other local businesses. They become a draw for downtown New London. And people, oh yeah, I love this city. This is a great city. Look at the people who live here. You know, these people, these artists, that's one of our resources too.
So I applaud those efforts. And but I'm going to ask you a question that's I get asked from time to time,
sure.
and I've even, I think, thought from time to time, and that is in regards to the role of landmarks in trying to encourage restoration over whether it be demolition or, let's say, a vinyl siding or things of that nature. When property owners or building owners will argue, well, it's my property, why can't I do what I want to do with my stuff? Or my property.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Thank you. Thank you.
I think it's important because, you know, Landmarks doesn't have money to assist. They're kind of an advisory capacity to help stimulate. But you're the director, so I'll let you...
Sure. And, you know, it is a thorny question because in the United States, people feel very passionately about their property rights. But there are always restrictions on property rights in the United States if you live in a community with any zoning, for example. There is a recognition that what you do on your private property does affect your neighbors. And in Connecticut, what's interesting is that historic properties are protected like natural resources under our Environmental Protection Act. And let me talk about why. One essay that I read in the early 80s has always stuck with me. It was called The Tragedy of the Commons by Garrett Harding. Slender book or a long essay. It talks about a theoretical village in the UK, I believe, where there's a pasture that's commonly owned. And everybody's livestock is allowed to graze on that pasture. And it's a necessity for everybody that pasture remains productive, that it doesn't become overgrazed. And yet, it's to each individual property owner's individual benefit to have as much livestock as possible so they can maximize their own profits. And that livestock, it's to their benefit to have that livestock eating as much of that pasture up as possible right up until the very moment when there's no pasture left. That's the tragedy of an unregulated, commonly held resource. And if you look at Bank Street, for example, you have a bunch of private property owners, but you also have a common resource, which is a historic streetscape, not the individual buildings, but that experience of walking along the street and seeing historic building after historic building after historic building that tells our mutual history. Now, I think normally people think about the Environmental Protection Act as protecting air, protecting water, protecting soil from contamination. It's maybe a little more difficult to go, oh, why would historic structures be protected under that? But on Bank Street, for example, if one property owner says, I'm going to tear down this historic property and I'm going to build a bunch of residential units here, and I'm going to market them as being in historic downtown New London, that person gets to jack up their rents because it's in a beautiful location, beautiful historic location, and he's diminishing the resource that everybody else depends on, even including that property owner. But still, it's to each person's benefit to chip away at it until it's gone, because sometimes it is more expensive to rehab an old building. Sometimes it is, in the moment, an economically wise decision to tear something down, build something taller, modern, more residential units. But maybe the person on either side is now going, oh no, my property is no longer surrounded by other historic properties. And maybe the person across the street says, oh, maybe investing here isn't such a good idea, because what is my view going to be? I have no protection. I don't know. And so now a neighborhood loses value, even though an individual property might rise in value.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, we were talking earlier about redevelopment and urban renewal. I mean, the Winthrop Cove renewal came right up to what's now the Parade Plaza. I mean, Union Plaza is certainly a relatively modern complex. It's right on the border of Bank Street.
Yeah. Yeah.
And matter of fact, the Parade Plaza itself was reconfigured relatively recently.
Landmarks had a role in that, I believe.
For the express purpose of opening up the vistas that were basically blocked with the original construction of Captain's Walk, which goes back another 40 years or so. And I have to admit an element of skepticism with this reconstruction, which was Bruce Hyde was intimately involved with when he was running the development office. But I must say, since it's been completed, I have been pleasantly, I'll say, surprised. I mean, when you come down Bank Street and you can see the bridge, you can see the ferries, you can see the train station. I think it's terrific, and I'm quite frankly, I'm worried about this proposed pedestrian overpass, which will obscure much of what was taken apart to create what we have now with this walkway. And I wonder if that's in our best interest, but that's maybe a different discussion for another time.
I can't add much to that discussion because I've been so involved in our campaign right now to save the Bank Street streetscape that I haven't even begun to look at what you're talking about. But I will say that I have been upstairs recently in the apartments on State Street in the building where Quinn and Harry is located. Yep. Beautiful, beautiful apartments. And that exact view that you're talking about is one of the main draws for those apartments. They were just rented too. That's another good example of how historic preservation drives economic development, because they rented for a pretty penny.
Yeah, well, but that's what's going to ultimately be the renaissance and the driver, for downtown. I mean, having the upper floors of these buildings with people living in them, and
that's right.
And one thing, and we've discussed this before, regarding a trip that was sponsored by Newland and Main Street a number of years ago. Tony Silvestri was kind of the ringleader. Excuse me. It happened to be the year I was mayor of the city, and we had an overnight trip where we visited Newburyport, Massachusetts, and Portland, Maine, and Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And the purpose of that was to visit 3 communities that were A, waterfront, and B, had all experienced some level of urban renewal. And how have they managed to turn the corner where New London seems to a degree, be on a treadmill, having a hard time getting off?
I think we're picking up momentum, though.
Well, I sincerely hope that you're correct there, but they're ahead of us in what they're doing. Yeah. And in Portsmouth, in particular, they have stopped tearing down. I mean, and so they have maintained their historic downtown. Right. And it didn't allow the creep that we have, mentioning Union Plaza. And that requires diligence, it requires sustained hard work.
A clear vision.
And vision is a very good term. And it requires entrepreneurs who are willing to invest in these small shops and make it that unique shopping experience or dining experience with small business people.
In fact, what you
don't
just
get
said,
downtown Walmart.
That's right. That's right. Although I think that there are some areas where big chain stores are locating in historic downtowns, and that can anchor a downtown as well and help other smaller businesses thrive next to them. When I think about where would I like to go for a day trip, I don't think about specific stores or specific restaurants. I think about specific streetscapes. And before I even know what's on the other side of a shop door, I go, oh, this is a charming place and I want to come back here. And I cannot even remember the last time that I chose to visit a town that did not have an intact historic downtown. And I didn't even think of myself as a preservationist. I just knew that that's what I was drawn to.
Yeah.
And I think,
people will go to Portsmouth or downtown Portland, which is a working harbor.
Mm-hmm.
I think Newburyport, which is a little bit higher end, is maybe a little bit disjointed compared to New London. But Portland and Portsmouth, I think the comparisons are fair.
Mm-hmm. And there are not a lot of cities that we can compare ourselves to because there are not a lot of intact old maritime port cities. We are very special, and sometimes I wonder if we even recognize how special that relationship is. We have intact Star Street, where the artisans lived, and their connection to the maritime workers. We have this intact waterfront. We did have the railroad tracks cut through in the mid, I think, 1853, around then.
In that time frame.
Yeah. So then those buildings became somewhat disconnected from the waterfront. But now we're a multimodal transportation center.
But in that era, you're dealing in a waterfront that was commercial. You weren't looking at it as a...
It was a working waterfront. That's right. Right. It wasn't where people were shopping for their clothes.
So a different use. The
mm-hmm.
railroad was not an impediment at that time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Exactly. But we still have the layout and we still have the streetscape. If you don't mind, I would like to seg into talking about our current campaign to save 2 buildings along Bank Street.
Please do.
Sure. Right around the time that I became executive director of Landmarks, just a few weeks ahead of that, we found out that one of the property owners had filed for a demolition permit for 130 Bank Street, which I used to live in when I first came to New London. My husband and I lived there, and he had his shop right next door in what is now the framing studio for Studio 33. So I love that building. That little section of Bank Street is literally what brought me to New London. But we found out about that, and we thought, well, we should take a tour of 130 Bank Street. We should find out what condition it's in. Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation came down. Bill Cornish, the property owner, was kind enough to let us in and examine the building with a structural engineer and with a photographer so we could document it. And we were also there to speak to him about the possibilities of using historic tax credits. What are the alternatives to demolition? How could this be a project that works for you and for your neighbors? And then, a couple weeks later, he filed for a second demolition permit for the building right next door, 116 Bank Street.
There is an open space in between them.
Yeah, a small open space. That's right, with a water view, which is also historic. So 130 Bank Street, it's been vacant for a while. It's been vacant, I believe, since 2012. In 2010, the Capano family had plans approved by Planning and Zoning to turn it into a pub, but that didn't come to fruition.
No, but they got their zoning approvals.
They got the approvals. They gutted the interior. The interesting thing about gutting an interior of a historic building is that if you want adaptive reuse, now you might walk through and go, oh, this building's terrible. This building's in awful shape. What are you going to do with this? Actually, some of the expensive work has already been done. Because now you have like a blank slate and you can reconfigure it as you wish. Not to say that there aren't challenges with that building. The structural engineer who toured it said that it is repairable. But she also put together a list of what the cost would be. We know that it can be done. We know that there are ways to make that profitable and for Bill Cornish to recoup his money and have a positive cash flow. Or if he decides to sell the building down the road, for somebody else. We have a path towards economic feasibility there. 116 Bank Street, interestingly enough, doesn't look like much. It's kind of obscured with siding. You might go, this is a very nondescript, why are you guys all up in arms about this building?
The 116.
116
Yes,
Bank
and
Street.
it's currently occupied.
It's occupied by a very popular small business, New London Inc. All the surrounding business owners that I have spoken with talk about how they bring in customers to all those other buildings. They tend to go down, and a group of friends will go, and while one person is getting their tattoo, everybody else is out patronizing the other establishments on Bank Street. And they're good neighbors.
Yeah. And that site, if I'm not mistaken, was the former place of business for, I guess you might call it the dirty bookstore.
Yeah, Bookazine.
Whatever.
Sure. Yep, that was our neighbors when we lived at 130.
But it's been a viable commercial building for a long time.
A long time. And when you look at historic buildings, it doesn't always make sense to look at, who lived here in the past few decades. Tenants come and go. Although we hope that New London Inc. will be there for a good long time because they're just, like I said, good neighbors, productive for downtown. But you have an adult bookstore, however you feel about that, that's not a reason to take down a building. But that building actually dates to between 1786 and 1789. It's one of very few wooden structures in downtown on Bank Street because in the early 1800s, wooden buildings were banned. Wooden construction was banned.
I can remember downtown one was burned to the ground.
Exactly. That's why 1781, Benedict Arnold's burning of New London. This was one of the first buildings to be rebuilt downtown. We believe that it's the oldest building on the water side of Bank Street downtown. Its original owner was a baker who had come here from England prior to the Revolutionary War. He had a contract with the government to provide bread to the Continental Army. And then he stayed there until he was in his 80s. I shouldn't laugh. He actually, I don't think this would be a bad way to go. He fell to his death from the upper stories of that building.
But in terms of where this procedure is, now Mr. Cornish is within his rights to apply for the applications to demolish.
Absolutely.
With either of the buildings.
Absolutely. There's no law that says a historic building cannot be demolished.
And he has done that.
Sure.
Part of the process, he's had to go to the Historic District Commission, which is
Correct.
a advisory panel that the city has. I'm not sure if they're council appointed or appointed by the mayor, but in any event, they have the capacity to make recommendations and suggestions to keep the building preserved as opposed to being demolished.
What they have the power to do, and it's actually because of landmarks that they have this power, they can impose a mandatory 180-day delay on demolition. 6 months, that's right. That was something that the executive director prior to Constance Christophic really worked hard to get into place.
That's Sandra Chalk.
Sandra Chalk, that's right. So we are lucky to have that. That gives us time in a situation like what we're currently facing to gauge, do we have or not have community support for preserving these buildings? We found out quite quickly that people care very passionately about this downtown streetscape. And I keep emphasizing streetscape because the individual buildings matter, but they matter even more as part of, they are in a row of 25 contiguous historic buildings on the water side of Bank Street. So you rip out 2 of them, you've taken out a pretty large chunk of that historic section of Bank Street. So I think it was within just a couple of weeks we had, I think 600 or close to 650 signatures saying yes, let's preserve these buildings. We were told by Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, that in order to have an impact, we ought to aim for at least 500. We are at over 1,500 petition signatures, so it's just a huge amount of community support for preserving these buildings. We also are very grateful to have a letter of support from Mayor Passero, the New London City Council. I'm very grateful to them because they unanimously passed a resolution asking the State Historic Preservation Council to recommend intervention by the State Attorney General under our Environmental Protection Act to intercede, file an injunction and stop the demolition of the buildings. And so we have a hearing coming up on July 5th. And we think that we've made a good case. We have shown that the public supports saving the buildings. Our municipal government supports saving the buildings. We've gotten a lot of favorable press. We got a favorable editorial from the day and a number of favorable columns.
A petition has been circulated. How many folks signed on to that petition?
1,518.
1,518.
Yes.
Now, just for the record, these petitions are not like a political referendum. I mean, these can be anybody can sign. You don't.
They're not binding. They're not legally
binding. You're not forcing a vote. It's basically a petition of support.
That's right. It's just so that the state can go, oh, yeah, a lot of people actually do support this. Because if we didn't have that, they wouldn't consider it worth their resources to fight the demolitions. We did very little door-to-door canvassing. I'm a person who loves to canvass, but that's my thing when I'm running a political campaign or if I'm running for office myself or an issue-based campaign. But I didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of campaigning. The way that we got most of the signatures was by having downtown businesses display the petitions in their own establishments and talk to their own customers. So they were in 17 downtown businesses. So that's another way that we were able to show a deep, broad support for saving these buildings and to show what does that mean for other downtown property owners.
Mm-hmm. So where are we in this process now?
We have just a few days ago I think it was last Friday, I sent off the petition signatures electronically. The letters of support. We got 27 letters of support from members of the community, 10 of which came from different local organizations, everything from the Hygienic to Southeastern Connecticut Cultural Coalition, the Connecticut chapter of the Sierra Club, because they were talking about it as an environmental issue, because when you demolish a building, there's a huge amount of material that goes into landfills. It's not a good use of our resources. So lots of support. All of that has now gone to the State Historic Preservation Council, Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, at their expense, got an architect to draw up renderings of how could this building be reused? How could this be profitable? What could this building that might look run down now? Let me help you imagine its potential. So we have that. We have an estimate of what would it cost to rehab these buildings, what would the funding look like, what would the return on the investment look like. So we have to demonstrate two things when we go to the State Historic Preservation Council. First, we have to show that we do have a broad level of community support. I think we have clearly done that. It's quite united support in the city. And then we also have to show that there's a feasible, prudent alternative to demolition. That language comes from our state statutes. So that's why we're showing Bill Cornish doesn't need to lose money at this. We don't want him to lose money at this. We want to show him a path towards profitability while maintaining these buildings.
Mm-hmm. Well, if folks are interested that maybe haven't participated in this particular discussion to date, if they are interested in doing so, should they contact you?
Sure. You can email me at director@newlondonlandmarks.org. If that's a little hard to remember, you can also just message me on our Facebook page.
And the phone number at the office?
860-442-0003. Again, 860-442-0003. Our office hours are Monday through Thursday, 11 to 3. Sometimes I do need to be out of the office if I'm having a meeting outside of our office. But I'm there pretty consistently. This morning I was not in the office for a good chunk of the time, but doing something else that we do. I was actually at a meeting where a bunch of local nonprofits that serve kind of a shared population. We're talking about coming together to perhaps rehab an older building and share office space. So I was talking to them about historic tax credits. How could the state help make this affordable?
Terrific. Now, one thing that you brought in, and I think we need to share with the audience, and that's this plaque.
Yeah.
Why don't you tip that up, and we'll get that up. And perhaps, folks, when you're, that looks terrific. Maybe move it to your left. There you go. When you're driving around town, especially in some of the older neighborhoods, you'll see these plaques often by the front door. And
I just ordered mine.
and perhaps you can outline what these signify and what they cost.
Sure.
And what do you have to get one?
So the name that you see at the top of the plaque was the original owner of your building. We have these whales on all of them because we're the whaling city. The date was the year that it was built. And sometimes that takes quite a bit of research because when we initially start looking through the land records, we might see the land transaction, but it might be a little harder to track down when was a structure built on that land. And then New London landmarks. I saw these even before I moved to New London, and I would think, oh, this must be a very special building. And to me, it's part of the branding of New London as a historic city. So it doesn't just serve the property owner, although you have this wonderful thing for your house. It's something that's about pride in our heritage here in New London. Your building does need to be 50 years old. That's not terribly old to qualify. And then
is it based purely on age, or does it have to have some semblance of architectural integrity to qualify?
Just age. So, and that makes sense to me because what we're saying is, by 50 years old, a building might be showing its age if it's not well maintained, right? So this is a way of a property owner saying, yeah, I care about my building. I'm going to maintain my building too. It's a fundraiser also for New London Landmarks. It helps us do what we do. We're not going to be able to meet our financial goals selling $25 annual memberships. So these cost $250 if you are not a member of New London Landmarks, $235 if you are a member. You don't just get the plaque for that. We also do a lot of research on your property. You get a whole list of whoever has ever owned your property. And we do biographical research as well. So you get a whole narrative about the different people that lived there. So we think it's a good deal for the person. They make really nice housewarming gifts, Christmas gifts.
But the property owner needs to initiate the process. It's not started by
We don't
landmarks.
knock on your door and say, we think your house is a great candidate. That's right. So if you want to order one of these, again, you can call me. You can email me at director@newlondonlandmarks.org, Facebook message me, or you can find all of this information on our own website, www.newlondonlandmarks.org, and there's a page for plaques, so you can.
I think they're pretty neat. I hope that folks will take advantage of it. Now, a year ago, Landmarks embarked on a new project, down at Ocean Beach, and the terms escaped me here. It was a home show.
Oh yeah. Our first annual, this old home show.
This old home show, and
I should say annual. I think it's going to be bi.
Well, I know we're not doing it this year, but
we're doing it on April 7th next year.
But I know, and I had just gotten involved with Landmarks when that took place, and I thought it was a lot to be. A lot of successes and certainly room for improvements. But for the first time out, it was fun.
It will probably be better.
The vendors and the folks who came enjoyed the experience.
I hope so. I think sometimes when you have a property that needs some work, you might be puzzled, like, how am I going to fix these historic windows, or what kind of paint would be appropriate, or how can I access these tax credits? So we can have a lot of people come And you can just walk from vendor to vendor to vendor and get all the information that you need. And so I think that's a real service, and I think it's a service for our vendors too. I hope that it makes economic sense for them to be there.
They've got to feel they're getting some value.
Exactly. By the way, when you rehab a building as opposed to demolishing it and doing new construction, that provides a lot of jobs in Connecticut. When for every dollar that is spent rehabbing a historic property, 83 cents goes right back into Connecticut workers' pockets, because rehabbing doesn't cost so much in supplies or materials, it's labor intensive. So that's jobs, and it's pretty decently paying jobs too.
I agree. Skilled, more so than slapping up a lot of modern materials, which have an element of skill, but not quite the artisanship that's required in some of the older structures. Also, in some of the background material you provided, we have you're going to have the State Historic Preservation is going to be holding a meeting in New London. Do you want to share what that's all about? And
yeah,
is
sure.
the public
Thank
invited?
You. Absolutely invited. We hope you will come. That is going to be on Wednesday night, July 19th, in the City Council chambers in City Hall upstairs on the 3rd floor. That's going to be from 7 to 9, I believe. Yeah, 7 to 9. And that's because every 5 years the state puts together their state historic preservation plan, and they want public input on that. So they're holding these meetings throughout the state. This is your chance to come here and say, we need some help with historic preservation. For example, maybe we need some help, maybe we need something to prevent people from allowing their buildings to deteriorate or demo by neglect, or we need extra funding, or we need to figure out how we can pour more resources into underserved neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are maybe on the verge of becoming blighted. Whatever your issue is with historic preservation, this is your chance to come and be heard and have some input.
Very good. Now, a program that's been relatively recent, ongoing, and it appears to me to be turning a neighborhood around is City Flats, which is Reed Street and Coit Street, West Coit Street, and Blindman Street behind Harbor Towers. And again, Tony Silvestri's been involved with that, but Landmarks has played, I believe, a role in working with Tony and his financial backers and effectuating this turnaround of a neighborhood that had seen better days.
The bones of the neighborhood have always been solid because this is an area that was never really touched by urban renewal. So you have a potential gem of a neighborhood that's within walking distance to downtown, but some of the buildings have seen better days. So Tony's idea was to maintain the historic streetscape. You walk along the streets, none of these buildings are being demolished. You're going, oh, beautiful architecture, bringing architecture back to its former glory. A lot of Greek revival houses there. But how do you do that affordably? And so his idea was chop them up, the interiors, turn them into condos, but they're intact houses from outside, right? Mm-hmm. So that was not a historic district, which meant that that whole section was not eligible for the historic tax credits that reimburse people up to, I think it's $30,000 per living unit. So for these houses that had multiple condos in them, he was able to get reimbursed for a big chunk of this. He wouldn't have been able to do it probably otherwise, or at least not affordably. So we helped him through the nominating process. We had an intern from Connecticut College that did a lot of research on the buildings. So something that maybe didn't look feasible, it opened up different avenues for him. So we think that that's one of our biggest successes.
Well, I think that, again, that's terrific. And I think it's important, folks, to understand that Landmarks is proactive and it's not a nag.
Right. And we're not going to impose something on you that you don't want. If you want to learn, how could my neighborhood benefit by becoming a historic district, or is that a reasonable possibility for us? We can connect you to the state. We can help you with that process. Recently, we had a workshop on historic tax credits, which homeowners are only eligible for if their house is on a national register or state register of but if you're not, that doesn't mean that you're forever ineligible. It just means talk to your neighbors, come together, decide, yes, we want this. And that's really what happened with Hodges Square. They are a recent historic district. So they work with landmarks. So now that neighborhood has a better shot of revitalization.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing I know over the course of time and being involved in local politics is that Landmarks has just about every year they host a political forum during a campaign season, whether it's for for mayor or for council, state offices, at the local level, state senators, state reps, and primarily geared towards candidates' views on preservation and working in that particular area, economic development. Perhaps you can share, highlight a little bit more than that.
Well, you and I both participated in that.
We have. I've participated more than one.
That's so we will be doing that again this fall. We haven't set an exact date, but I'm sure it'll be in the library again, and all of our council candidates will be invited. Certainly with everything going on Bank Street, with us putting together our plan for conservation and development, this is a good time for us to be talking about what kinds of protections do we want? Do we want to strengthen protections for historic preservation? How does it drive economic development? What other steps can we take? How can we strengthen our blight ordinance? There's, I think when you and I were there, one of the questions they asked had to do with the National Coast Guard Museum, and how is that going to fit in with our historic downtown, and what would that do for us? Certainly, if people have issues that they would like us to talk about, again, email me, director@newlondonlandmarks.org.
Very good. And another thing too, I think folks need to be cognizant of is that Landmarks at the office has got a significant amount of information and data that's available for folks for perhaps for research purposes. And we also collect, if people have got germane material that
we would love to scan it and put it in our files. We collect everything from the newspaper clippings to when we do the research for the plaque houses. We also keep a copy here so that that's now available to anybody. That's one way that we can build like a library of this research. Speaking of which, one of our board members, our newest board member, Rose Oliveira, is working on a project to digitize a lot of the resources that we have in our office so that you won't need to come in Monday through Thursday, 11 to 3, or make an appointment, that you'll be able to do some of this research online. So already online we have all of the historic districts, except for Hodges Square, because that one's not finalized yet. I think there have been some minor amendments to the initial nominating packet, but it's almost there. But if you say, for example, is my house, is it in a historic district? Would I qualify? You could call. We can look it up for you, but you can also look it up yourself. Or maybe, I think more and more we're going to have the historic photos, which are always a lot of fun for people. Anytime we post historic photos on social media, everybody loves them.
That's terrific. Well, we're down to about our last minute, and I'm just, if there's anything that we haven't touched on in 60 seconds or less that you'd like to close out the program with, the floor is yours.
One of the things that I am hopeful that we're going to be able to do with the city is to take a look at how do we keep a building from falling into irreversible irrepair. And it's called demolition by neglect. 66 Franklin Street, for example. Now, the owner, Shiloh Baptist Church, were very good about working with us, trying to market the building to sell it for $1. But animals got in, people got in, water got in, birds got in. It's beyond repair, most likely now. They're about to demo the building.
And that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So how do you prevent that? How do you prevent that from happening at 130 Bank Street? how can we do that with Thank you for asking me. Thank you so much for having me on, Marty.
Well, listen, thank you, and we'll see you again next week on City Focus. Good night.